Hello again everybody, and welcome to this, my next video. Here I'll be talking about some of my experiences with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or as they're more colloquially known, the Mormons. I have to say I was quite surprised by a lot of the things I found when I was investigating this interesting group of people. So, as correcting some false ideas I had about Mormons and giving some information on them, this video will also be about the experiences I had with the Latter-day Saints or Mormon Church. I've done my best with my research to make sure everything's as accurate as I can make it. Any mistakes in here are my own. I hope it comes across, but this has been a really interesting story for me, as well as a surprising one. Growing up, there was a church not too far from where I lived, which my parents told me to stay away from. They treated it with suspicion and didn't like me to have too much to do with it. It was a Mormon church. This attitude of suspicion was most clear when once we had Mormon missionaries knock on our door. My parents told me to answer it and shut themselves away in the kitchen because they didn't want to interact with them at all. I didn't get too much of an impression from that particular visit, except that the missionaries seemed perfectly polite and everything. But that attitude of wariness my parents showed stayed with me, and is one that I think a lot of people still have towards the Latter-day Saint or LDS community, as they like to be known. If you look at pop culture, portrayals of Mormons don't often do the church any favours. Yet there is clearly a fascination there. There are loads of programs and different things out at the moment about Mormonism. So, at the same time as being wary, people are also interested. For me, reality TV is a bit like watching paint dry, but there is a series called The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, among other programs. American Primeval talks a lot about the early history of the settlement of Utah, and the Mormons play quite a prominent role in that. And from what I understand, they are not very positively portrayed, especially their prophet Brigham Young. Under the Banner of Heaven is a program I have seen. It's a police drama, and although it does give a bit more of an even-handed account, it goes quite a lot into controversial aspects of the church's foundation, and its influence is portrayed as actively hampering the police investigation that the plot centres around. They don't come off too well here either. The missionaries, at least, are a bit more sympathetically portrayed in the film Heretic. I was a bit in two minds whether to see this film or not, because I didn't like the idea of someone being so cruel and manipulative towards the missionaries, but I did go and see it. And the missionaries are portrayed positively here, but there's still a lot of negativity about the Latter-day Saint religion and church, and a lot of criticism of its founder Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon musical, created by the same people who made South Park, is very famous, and another piece of media I have seen on this subject. To my mind, although it's very crude, it's definitely an affectionate mixtape, but it's very, very definitely a satire of the Latter-day Saints religion. A very funny one, I have to say. I really enjoyed it, but at the same time, as I would with watching a South Park episode, which is also something I very much enjoy, I would take any information presented in this musical with a bit of a pinch of salt. It's worth pointing out that there are other films that are a bit more pro-LDS as well. Films like The Saratov Approach show two LDS missionaries in Russia who faced some quite extreme circumstances and used their faith to overcome them. There are also films like Jane and Emma, which talk about some of the early Latter-day Saints church experiences, and the reality of how it was at that time for the early Mormons in Nauvoo. Overall, I think these films reflect a kind of general impression in popular culture that there's something a little bit unusual about the Mormon Church, a little bit perhaps strange, something people are a little wary of, yet also curious enough to keep making these films. So, when my friend phoned me up and told me about something he had been experiencing and asked if I wanted to go along with him to the Latter-day Saints Church here in my town, of course I was quite curious to find out for myself what the truth actually was. I was quite keen to go along and find out for myself. And so it began. And it all began with a kettle. One morning, 2 Latter-day Saint missionaries were on their prep day when their kettle broke, so they went to town on the bus to buy a new one. On their way back, they met a young woman who happened to be my friend's daughter, and they struck up a conversation, mentioning that they were from the church. Ever since that point, that little girl started bugging her father about wanting to go to the church those 2 missionaries were from. Now, I suppose young women are kind of impressionable at that age, and she liked the fact that the older girls had taken an interest in her. And so when my friend said, "Do you want to go along and check out what you think of it, because I don't want to go on my own?" I said, "Yeah, fine, I'll give that a go." At that time, little did I know I would go on to see that friend and his family be baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'd end up getting invites to LDS events that happen at that church, and I still do get the odd invite, and it's always gratefully received. Little did I know that I would go on to actually attend the church a few times myself over a few weeks, getting a reliable impression of a typical Mormon Sunday service. And little did I know I'd end up making friends with missionaries from all sorts of different parts of the world. And I'd even get to visit the nearest Latter-day Saint temple, which also had a missionary training centre attached to it, and be able to wander the grounds freely. Before we get to these experiences though, I want to talk a little bit about some of my preconceptions, some of the stereotypes I had in my mind about Latter-day Saints, and Latter-day Saint missionaries in particular. Growing up, my parents had always warned me to steer clear of that whole kind of thing. I also remember having watched a TV documentary about Latter-day Saint missionaries, in which the documentary implied that they were constantly being watched by their bishops and mission presidents, badly fed, and constantly having to knock on doors of people who were disengaged, not interested, and just wanted them to go away. And I could well imagine these poor young men in that situation getting sworn at, constantly monitored, and having to go door to door for their church. I thought that would end up with them developing something of a persecution complex, an attitude that would result in them perhaps not having the greatest sense of humour about their faith, being quite sensitive to criticism, and mirroring the quite rule-based attitudes that their superiors showed towards them. I thought they'd be very drilled in theology. I was expecting a hard sell from the missionaries. I expected them to give me and my friend a bit of the old eternal burn and a fair bit of pushiness. "Oh, please come to this, please do that, please take this book and read it," that kind of thing. The reality was quite different. For example, when I showed a couple of elders the slides for this presentation, we came to this slide we are on now, and I said to them, "If you don't like this picture, I can change it." But as I turned to look at the elder, I saw he was already laughing, and he said to me, No, keep it in, it is quite funny." And so I think that gives you an idea of the sort of people who do tend to be elders and sisters going out for the LDS Church. They're not the sort of people who are going to see a picture like that and take offence. They're more likely to have a laugh at it and be able to laugh with any kind of light-hearted criticism, rather than getting funny and offended by it, which is good. This is something I think is in the LDS Church's favour. They tend to laugh with the criticism rather than trying to drown it out. They even use it to their own advantage. In fact, the time I mentioned before when I went to see the Book of Mormon musical, when we left the theatre, there were a large number of Latter-day Saint missionaries outside, not trying to protest against the play, but with a positive message. You've seen the satire? If you want to hear our side of it, we're here for you. I reflected on the irony of having said to the young lady who spoke to me, "Fair play to you for being here. You've clearly got balls." Moving on from that embarrassing first encounter, though, when me and my friend turned up at our first LDS Church meeting, we tried to sneak in quietly and sit at the back. Instead, we were greeted by two sister missionaries, all smiles, who sat with us, explained how everything worked, and answered our questions. When I said I didn't want to take communion, the sister with me just said that's totally fine. There was no pressure, just kindness. They let us know there was an open house on Tuesday if we fancied it. And my friend decided yes, he did want to go along to that, and I was happy to go with him. As the months went on and my friend's family got more involved, I got to know a few missionaries a bit better. I found them surprisingly relatable. Most were young, 19 to 22 years old, and often away from home for the first time. Though they always smiled and put on a brave face, you could tell that many were very naturally homesick. One evening at my friend's house, he often had missionaries round for tea, we ended up watching videos of each other's respective hometowns. I remember thinking how far from home the missionaries were and how hard that must be. One sister in particular told me that Christmas had been an especially tough time for her. She missed her family a lot. The missionaries were always polite and upbeat, but you could see that it wasn't always easy for them. What struck me was that no one ever tried to police my behaviour. They'd offer things, but never demand. It was always, "We've got this thing Tuesday, come along if you want," or "We could meet up or not, it's totally up to you." When my friend decided to go further with the church, I politely stepped back. I was still curious, but I didn't want to waste the missionaries' time. My own ideas about religion were fairly fixed. That said, my attitude shifted a bit when I saw how much the church helped my friend's wife. She had always been quite quiet and reserved, but once she joined the church, she came right out of her shell. I remember one time we were giving the sister missionaries a lift home. Because of the rules, she had to ride along so I wasn't alone with them in the car. I said something about the LDS Church expecting one of the missionaries to respond, but it was my friend's wife who jumped in. She started telling me about her experiences, what the church had done for her, and why she thought it was good. And I thought, hang on, this is someone who hardly used to say boo to a goose, and here she was confidently chatting away. Something had clearly changed. She seemed happier. And that made me think I'd been a bit too quick to dismiss it all. So I did meet up with the missionaries a few times after that. But again, they never pushed. Whenever I hit on something whenever we hit on something I couldn't accept, they'd just say, "Pray and ask God." It was their go-to response. And after a while, I reached a point where I felt ready to just leave the whole thing, and I said, "I think I'll stop meeting with you if that's alright." And they just said, "Of course, no problem at all. No pressure, no drama." One thing I noticed was that they weren't trained apologists. When I brought up something like the textual criticism of the Bible, I'd just get blank looks. But I didn't press it. They weren't there to argue. They were young people doing their best to follow what they believed God wanted. And I respect that. They weren't just knocking doors either. They got involved in all sorts: gardening, litter picks, helping out where they could. The two elders in this video even joined local WhatsApp groups to find ways to help in the community. And I think, whatever your beliefs, if someone's come halfway around the world to help tidy up a council estate on a drizzly weekday afternoon, fair play to them. They do have rules. There's shirts and ties, the name badges, but there is some flexibility. More than I'd realised. The two in the photo here aren't wearing the classic uniform. One sister I met even had her football team colours inside of her badge. And in normal conversation, they're more likely to talk about Fortnite or football than deep theology. Disaster nearly struck though on our second visit to the church. It was a Tuesday, and after a short presentation, the missionaries went off to do a painting activity with the kids, while me and my friends stayed chatting in the sanctuary. When we went to collect the kids, we spotted one of my friend's children next to a Book of Mormon, absolutely covered in paint. The book was plastered, front, back, spine, every colour of the rainbow. And me and my friend looked at each other in panic. Our eyebrows went right up. We were both thinking, oh no, the kids have just defaced these guys' holy book. My friend went straight over and said, I'm really sorry, my kids have painted all over your Book of Mormon. We were bracing ourselves for a telling off, but the missionaries just burst out laughing. No, it's fine, they said. That's what they were meant to do. Look, we've done ours too. And one of them showed us a lovely scene she had painted of the local area on the front of her Book of Mormon. That was quite a relief, and it showed us that they weren't as uptight as we'd assumed. As for theology, whenever a tricky question came up, they'd always circle back to the same idea: pray and ask God. That's very much the rhythm of the Latter-day Saint approach. Don't argue, don't debate, just ask God and see what you feel. And to be honest, there's definitely worse ways of approaching things. But what is life actually like for LDS missionaries? Here are some things that I've discovered. One day in every 7 is what they call a P-Day, a preparation day. It's their day off to do laundry, housework, and contact family back home. This matters a lot, especially as it's the first time many of them are away from home, learning how to live independently. It's also the day to go out and buy kettles, if needs be. The missionaries' routine is quite strict. Every day begins at 6:30 a.m. on the dot. From then until 9 a.m. they exercise, study, pray, and plan for the day ahead. From 9 a.m. to 9 p.m, 12 hours, it's all about service. This can vary. Some elders told me they now get 2 or 3 social media inquiries a day, people reaching out to learn more about the church from social media. I was surprised at the number. They're moving more towards social media outreach and away from door knocking, and it seems to work better for them. I'd assumed that their access to social media was minimal, just dumb phones, but they often join local WhatsApp groups to find community activities. Instead of pushing religion directly, they get involved. I heard examples of missionaries mucking out a donkey sanctuary, gardening, visiting the elderly, and even helping at Poppy Day stands, although doing that without wearing their badges. Of course, their biggest task is teaching about their faith. For that, they use a manual called Preach My Gospel, which is increasingly multimedia based. The missionaries I spoke to praised it. It gave them a shared structure so they could sync easily, knowing what to do from day one. It's now available as a phone app, so lesson plans can be accessed on the go. Becoming a missionary for the LDS Church is voluntary, although there's more social pressure on boys to serve. Service lasts for 2 years for boys and 18 months for girls. The journey begins with a bureaucratic task, filling out a form and getting the approval of their local bishop. A bishop in the Mormon tradition is like a pastor or a vicar. He runs the church and the congregation. Once approved, the missionaries go to a missionary training centre. For those from Utah, they might be close to home. Others might train on site. In England, there's a training centre where they typically spend 2 to 3 weeks if they're teaching in their native language, or 6 to 9 weeks if learning a foreign language. Name badges and timekeeping are strict. The name badges are everywhere. But there are other rules too. Missionaries must stay in visual or audio contact with their assigned companion at all times, and they're not allowed to swim or play competitive sports. Still, I got the impression they felt they were trusted. They met regularly with other missionaries and felt leadership gave them space. One even said to me, "If we wanted to, we could just go back to bed at 9 o'clock and sleep all day and no one would know. But we don't. We get up and do it because we want to." Another thing I didn't expect, and probably should have, was how fond they were of their missions. One said, "I want to get the most out of this time." To outsiders, it might seem odd to go halfway around the world and live under extra rules. But why the fondness? One missionary used the phrase "set apart" to describe her time. I can see that. It's a sacred, special phase in their lives. They're no longer known by their first names, but as elder or sister. They get a new name, a special dress, a new place to live, something that takes them out of their normal life and drops them in a completely different environment. They have to adapt, and they learn that they can. There's also a sense that mission life trains them for what comes next. One missionary said, "When you're married, you're going to be around someone all the time, so you may as well get used to that as a missionary." When I talked with people, the regular congregation members, a lot of them looked back quite fondly on their time as missionaries. Anecdotes from missions, asking where someone had served, were regular topics of conversation and pride for members who had been on missions, and I could definitely understand why. The congregation was one of the first things I noticed about the church we visited. It was made up of lots of different families as well as single people of all different ages and backgrounds. Getting to talk to them, there were sewage workers, doctors, self-employed people, council workers, people from all over the place. We even recognised one of our local rugby team's players who hailed from Polynesia, a local celebrity, which was quite a surprise to see. After a while, after I'd been to a few meetings and social events, I almost felt I had got to be on the inside of that community. People started to assume that I actually was LDS as well, so it was kind of interesting sometimes hearing them talk about non-LDS people. I never encountered any kind of anti-outsider prejudice. which you do get in a lot of in-groups, especially in groups that society tends to be a little wary of. The only thing I did come across was a bit of frustration about being made fun of. There was a sense of being singled out, a feeling that while there are loads of programs and content criticised of the Latter-day Saint Church, you don't see other religions subjected to quite the same degree of scrutiny. But for the most part, the people I spoke to there were just regular people. They didn't tend to talk an awful lot about the theology behind their religion. Like the missionaries, away from specifically religious events, they were more likely to talk football than theology. Which leads me to one of the most concerning aspects of my time getting to know some of these Latter-day Saints. And I hesitate to report this, but I have to tell the truth in this video essay. Some of these Latter-day Saints, I am sorry to say, were Manchester United fans. I did try to explain to them that you're not actually supposed to support that team. That they even put an emblem of Satan himself on the badge so you know that they are the bad guys. I said to them, surely if you're Latter-day Saints you should be supporting Southampton. They're literally known as the Saints. But sadly these misguided people didn't listen. We can only hope that one day these individuals will see the error of their ways and turn from supporting Manchester United. Another thing I noticed at the Latter-day Saint Church was that a lot of the activities were separated into men and women. A typical Latter-day Church service consists of an hour of worship and sermons, and then for the next hour, separation into men and women for group discussion. There was a PowerPoint presentation with the discussion, and it was only about 5 minutes in that I realised, oh, it's just men here. And I became quite conscious of that. And I wondered, how many other places are there in society today where there are no women present? As a man, I can't really think of any other places where it's just blokes. I couldn't remember the last time I'd be in a public space where it was all men. Even at football, there are many women these days who will go along to support their team. And actually, I was surprised to find that quite relaxing and refreshing. To be in an all-male environment like that, I did quite like having that all-male space. Another stereotype I held that was quickly shattered during that first church service was that I'd always been told that Mormons really frown on divorce and that they didn't let women teach. But in the first sermon we heard in that Latter-day Saint church, a woman got up to give the sermon, and in her sermon she significantly referenced her divorce. And this just gave the lie quite early on to what I'd been told. They do let women teach, and that stigma against divorce that I'd heard about couldn't have been anywhere near as bad as I had heard. In fact, that particular Latter-day Saint church was a lot more accepting of those kind of things than a lot of Protestant churches I've been to. Another thing which surprised me was when I was invited to a Halloween meeting the Mormons were having in their church. They had people dressing up, kids going around with sweets, all sorts, and this wasn't a light party or an alternative to Halloween. No, they were quite happy openly celebrating Halloween in the church, which really shocked me. Growing up, all the Christian churches I'd ever been a part of always were either against the celebration of Halloween or would set up something like a light party to be an alternative to Halloween, and a very consciously an alternative rather than going along with their tradition. So it really surprised me that this didn't seem to be an issue at all for the Latter-day Saints. But social stuff is really important in the Latter-day Saints church, as well as the religious function of the church. The church I visited had a Tuesday men's group, a walking group, an informal football team, even games evenings, which I still get the elder invite to even now, which is fantastic. They're great people, and their church really has a community feel to it, which is very welcoming. On one occasion, we even got to watch together a World Cup match, which was fun. It would have been more fun if the England team had played like they were in a competition, but you can't have everything, I guess. In terms of the building itself, one thing I noticed, certainly about the sanctuary, is that it seemed very, very Protestant. There were no icons, no pictures, no stained glass windows, not even a cross. The saints themselves were very trusting of us though. They weren't particular about the sanctuary. The first time we visited on a Tuesday, my friend and I were just left in there to have a chat while the kids got on with their painting and the men and women went off and did their own thing. We were two strangers, and yet we were just left there quite happily in the sanctuary to chat amongst ourselves. The door was unlocked, anyone could have just walked in or out, but they were quite chilled out. That was the impression that I had. Despite the lack of ornamentation and the laid-back atmosphere, however, the space still did give that sense of sacredness, which to my surprise my friend picked up on. He had previously always said to me, "If it doesn't have statues or stained glass windows, it's not a proper church. And if it used to be a warehouse, then it's not a church, it doesn't count." And so when I asked him, "Do you feel close to your grandmother in a place like this?" I was surprised to hear his reply, "Yeah, I do feel my grandmother here in the room." Just like he would have said had we been in a Catholic church. The building was quite old school, definitely pews and hymn books, not chairs and PowerPoint. Another thing that surprised me was the seating arrangement. You can see here in the picture the congregation sits in the pews, and then the bishop and his family or advisors sit on chairs facing the congregation. So they definitely can't be caught fiddling with their phone or falling asleep halfway through the service. No chance of that. In some ways, Latter-day Saints can also be very Pentecostal. Once a month, they have testimony meetings, where some members go to the front and talk about what they feel God is doing in their lives and how they feel God is interacting with them. Anyone can go up, and it's quite cool to see how people are getting on with their walk of faith. There's a lot of spontaneity in that, which I think is really good. Another example of that spontaneity I encountered was once when there was a baby naming ceremony. At that time, all the men gathered around the baby, putting their hands together with the baby in the middle of the circle, and the dad prayed a blessing over the child. The blessing from the father wasn't read from a book, nor was it at all formulaic. The man simply prayed from his heart, expressing his wishes for the child and asking Heavenly Father to help in the baby's life. I can't remember exactly what he said, but I do remember the emotion which came across. I remember feeling quite touched by it. I love that freedom for people to speak from their hearts before God. I really admire that ethos a lot. So, I've talked a lot about these Latter-day Saints and who they are. I have shared some of my experiences about the church. But what is the story of the Mormon Church? Where does it come from? And why does it even exist? One repeated challenge the saints made to me during my investigation of their church was, pray about it, ask God to reveal the answer to you, and see how you feel. There's a lot of emphasis in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on feelings. And the story of how their church came to be is certainly full of feeling. It's worthy of a drama, and I would love to see a film that really does that justice. It all began with a teenager in New England called Joseph Smith. Some have described him as a treasure hunter. In the West Country, we would have called him a dowser, someone who searches for treasure with dowsing rods, trying to find lost things. It's a profession we don't see much now. It's a bit old-fashioned, but you still get the odd person who'll dowse a field, and it does work. I've done it. You can find water that way. Joseph Smith, anyway, was hired by farmers and landowners in New England to find lost things or to check for gold, and that's how he earned a living. He also wondered a lot about religion, especially after the death of his brother, who he was close to. As he grew up, there were many churches where he lived, Anglicans, Methodists, Baptists. Each claimed to be the right one and told people not to go to the others. And that got Joseph to thinking, how do I know which church is the right one? And so Joseph did what many good Christians would feel was a solid idea. He sat down and prayed. And after some time, he said an angel appeared to him and eventually revealed golden plates. Years later, he confided in others and began the work of reading from these plates, using a seer stone to help him. One thing I'd always heard, like from the South Park creators, is that no one else ever saw the plates. But actually other people did. One man later disagreed with Joseph and said he'd gone off course, but he still went to his death saying he'd definitely seen the plates. What they were? Who knows? Maybe you should pray and God will reveal it. There are worse things you could do. Either way, we don't have the plates now. But it's notable that close associates did see a physical object. There's more than just Joseph's word to go on. Once translated, Joseph produced a book, the Book of Mormon. Latter-day Saints still believe in it today. That's where the nickname Mormons comes from. Joseph began preaching from the book and started a church based on it and the Bible. Many thought this was mad. The Bible's complete, no more books. But Joseph felt he had to follow what God had revealed to him. There was a lot of conflict. Joseph and his followers kept having to relocate, going to places like Missouri to find somewhere safe to build their church. But people, wherever they went, persecuted the Mormons. They didn't want them there and drove them out. The Mormons kept having to move on. Eventually, they ended up in a place called Nauvoo, where they tried to settle and build a proper community, somewhere they could have their own town and build a temple, which is something vital for their faith to be practiced properly. At the time, many accused Joseph Smith of running a cult. They didn't trust what he was doing and felt threatened. Eventually, Joseph was arrested and imprisoned. A mob surrounded the jail, stormed it, and killed Joseph and his companions. Through all his troubles, Joseph was offered ways out. He could have denied it all, but he never did. He always said, "This is true, and I'm doing what God told me." Sadly, he died at the hands of that mob. After his death, a man named Brigham Young took over leadership of most of the Mormons. They went west together, crossing the Great Plains. You can see them in that middle picture. They used handcarts because they couldn't afford wagons or horses like other pioneers. They were desperate, to get away to safety. Despite the disadvantages, they crossed the continent until they found a wide, desolate salt lake on the other side of the Rockies. When they got there, Brigham Young declared, "This is the place." That's where they built their new city and began settling the area that would become Utah. Their first city was Salt Lake City. Today, it's a major hub, and the LDS Church still has its headquarters there. The surrounding region was settled, and the Mormons were finally able to live in peace and safety. Today, the church is a global religion with over 17.5 million members. About 186,000 of those are in the UK, not a small number by any means. They've got about 74,000 missionaries out in the world right now. But the biggest concentration of Mormons is in Utah and the surrounding states, an area called the Mormon Corridor or the Jelly Belt, because of the stereotype that Mormons love jelly and fizzy drinks. And you can see them in the bottom right picture, happy with all the jelly and fizzy drinks they could want, and the temple in the background. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, at least as I understand it. So I hope I've done it justice. As well as their founding story, another thing quite unique to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is their idea of what I've termed human destiny on this slide. It's almost like a life cycle. They call it the plan of salvation, but it is quite different from the mainstream Christianity concept of salvation. It's interesting that they believe in what they call the pre-mortal life. Latter-day Saints believe that before we were born, we were actually alive and born to and were loved by a heavenly Father and a heavenly Mother. They tend to use those terms rather than God and Goddess. At some point in that pre-mortal life, we chose to come into this world, and then you were born. After we're born, the veil comes down, so we can't remember what happened before. But the choice was made by us. That was one thing that really surprised me, that they have a concept of a goddess in their religion, their true state of Heavenly Mother. I had heard before the idea that we choose to come into this world before we were born as well, but I had always associated that idea more with New Age spirituality than any type of Christianity. The earth that we live on, they call the second estate, the first estate being before we were born. There are basically 3 ways we can go after this life. If we live our lives in what's called the low way, if we're liars, adulterers and so on, after we die we go to the telestial kingdom or telestial heaven. This is still heaven, so it's not a bad place. This is another thing that surprised me about the Mormons. They don't really have much of a concept of hell at all. In Protestantism, I was always taught that if you don't accept Jesus into your heart as your Lord and Saviour, you would go to hell. In the Latter-day Saint tradition, no, you don't even have to accept the Book of Mormon. It's not a massive problem if you don't. You just go to a different heaven. And it's still heaven, just not as good as the highest heaven you could get to. So, people who live a bad life go to the telestial kingdom. People who live a good and honourable life, but don't follow the LDS religion, go to the terrestrial kingdom. Then, if you go through the straight and narrow way, which is outlined in the Book of Mormon and the Bible, as well as a couple of other books Joseph Smith wrote, Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. If you stick to these, you can get into the Celestial Kingdom. The Celestial Kingdom even has different levels within it as well. People who've accepted baptism into the Latter-day Saint Church get into at least level 3. If they've had an endowment, they get into level 2. I'm not quite sure about all the rules around endowments, but that's something you'd need to do to get to that level. And then, if you've had a temple marriage, if you've been sealed in the temple, you can get into the top level of heaven, which is what the church is out there trying to help people do, according to its beliefs. There is an outer darkness for apostasy, but I don't get the impression that that's for regular people who turn away. From everything I've spoken to the elders and missionaries about, it would fall under being blinded by the craftiness of men. You'd have to be trying pretty hard to find your way into that outer darkness. You may also have heard talk about some far out ideas like Kholeb, and that the God of this world, the Mormon Heavenly Mother, was once a mortal being on another planet. You may also have heard that Mormons believe that they will go on to get a planet of their own at some point after the Celestial Kingdom. I can confirm that these ideas are actually true. However, this is not something I ever heard the LDS talk about with each other. I believe this is something which is quite distant and doesn't loom large in the Latter-day Saint consciousness. No one I'm aware of is going around talking and bragging about how much they are looking forward to one day getting their own planet. For regular Christians, however, the idea that humans will one day become gods themselves smacks of the lie the snake told Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. If you eat the fruit of knowledge, you will become like God, the snake said. The original sin itself that caused humankind to be expelled from paradise. They would not accept this as anything like a Christian teaching. On the other hand, a lot of Mormons will say they are 100% definitely Christian, but there are many differences between the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, and irregular garden variety churches. For a start, they have this guy here currently, President Nelson, who's their leader. He's probably, in terms of leadership, on the same kind of pedestal as the Pope is for Catholics. So for Protestants, this is quite a strange concept, to have such a highly stratified leadership. And there is a very stratified leadership structure. Underneath him is something called the Quorum of the 12. Just as Jesus had 12 apostles, Mormons have 12 people who make up their governing council. When you think of this human destiny diagram, you might wonder what happens if you passed away before hearing about the Book of Mormon. Or perhaps, like me, you thought the Book of Mormon wasn't for you, but later perhaps find out that you're wrong and that the Mormons were actually right all along. Well, hope is not lost, because they do this thing called baptisms for the dead. They have baptism pools in their temples, where you can be baptized on behalf of your ancestors. So in those situations, you can help people who passed away before you, even those who you never knew personally. That's a big difference from mainstream Christianity. My understanding of regular Protestant theology is that once a person is dead, that's it. It's up to God to judge, and there's nothing more a living person can do. Another big difference, as I mentioned earlier, is Joseph Smith's Book of Mormon. Depending on which side of the fence you fall on, you might say he translated it, or that he came up with it. It's not just that extra book of scripture either. The Mormons also have Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price. Together with the Bible, these are called the Quad. In terms of lifestyle, some big differences between Mormons and regular Christians include dietary rules. Basically, no nicotine, no caffeine, and no alcohol. The idea is that these will poison your body, but if you're living forever in the celestial kingdom, you are going to need your body in good shape, so you need to take good care of it, and part of that is avoiding nicotine, caffeine, and alcohol. The word of wisdom. Another big difference is temples. There's a massive culture within the Mormon Church around building temples and performing ordinances there. There are important rituals unique to Latter-day Saints that can only happen in temples and will affect your position in the celestial kingdom should you get there. So for those reasons, these places are really important to Mormons. I've had the privilege of visiting one, and they're actually really lovely places with well-kept gardens, beautiful buildings, unique architecture. Each one is special. I didn't get to go inside the temple, but I did get to go in the grounds and experience the atmosphere there. They are currently building a new temple in Birmingham, and if they're happy to let me, my intention very much is to visit the inside of that temple before it's consecrated. It will be a fascinating opportunity should I get it. Anyway, with these and other differences between Mormonism and Trinitarian Christianity, are Mormons Christian? There are a lot of similarities and a lot of differences too. I think it's a similar question as asking, are Christians Jews? Christians use the Jewish Bible as their scripture and have some rights in common, but also a lot of differences. The two faiths are kind of semi-detached, and I think the same can be said of Christianity and Mormonism. But is there any truth to all these Mormon ideas? Well, being a bit of a religion geek, I had to get hold of a copy of the Book of Mormon, and when I did, I started reading it. The first book is called First Nephi. And First Nephi really shocked me, because it fits with the setting of First Temple Judaism. It fits eerily well. My last video wasn't seen by too many people, and I understand why. It's quite a niche subject, but it talks a lot about the history of the ancient people of Israel and how our concept of God came into being. One thing I said in that video is that the people living in Jerusalem at the time when First Nephi is set had an idea of a god and his wife, a god and a goddess. In the picture to the left, you can see an image from that time, and the writing says Yahweh and his Asherah in Proto-Hebraic script. These are depictions of Yahweh and his wife Asherah just below the writing there. Another thing that really shocked me is the plot of 1 Nephi. In this book, a man called Lehi, a prophet of God, was forced to flee Jerusalem with his family. He was told by Heavenly Father that destruction was coming and that he and his family needed to get out. Jerusalem would be taken over by unrighteous men, so they fled into the wilderness. The Book of Mormon's 1 Nephi goes into quite a bit of detail about the route they took, and their route matches up really surprisingly well with the ancient incense trading routes that existed at the time. What gets a bit scary in terms of accuracy is that at one point there's a valley in the Book of Mormon that the Book of Mormon calls Nahum, where one of Lehi's good friends, Ishmael, died and was buried. In the 1990s, a number of pillars were dug up from that area. These pillars have Proto-Semitic writing on them, identifying the area as NHM. The similarity of names really shocked me. Don't forget, this is a book that was dictated by a guy in the 19th century United States of America. No one at that time had any idea that there had been a place in Arabia called Nahum over 1,000 years earlier. I say NHM as that script doesn't have the vowels, just the consonants. But people at the time of the Book of Mormon's revelation did not know the trade routes in that area in rural New England where Smith lived. The context of Lehi leaving Jerusalem is also very interesting. Around this time, the kingdom of Judah was starting to come together. People were starting to oppose the old prophetic tradition of people hearing from God directly, saying instead that God is unseen and that all we need to do is obey God's commandments. It was all about following the Deuteronomic codes rather than having a living relationship with God. So you can see how there could be a hierarchy in Jerusalem, perhaps under the king, who was bringing all of this religious understanding together under a centralized administration. And you can see how the old school prophetic figures, those who had a direct relationship with God, might have felt they had to leave that city, as this new centralized religion was not for them. A very interesting figure here in academic circles is Margaret Baker, a Methodist minister and academic who has been interviewed by several Latter-day Saints podcasters. She agrees with this assessment of Jerusalem at the time of 1 Nephi. That was really unexpected, and it really shocked me to learn how well the whole Book of Mormon story fits with the historical context of that time in the ancient Middle East. So the story is that Lehi left Jerusalem, fled down Arabia to a place eventually called Bountiful near the Indian Ocean, and after that God provided a boat, and Lehi's descendants sailed to America. The rest of the Book of Mormon tells the story of this civilization in America. I looked to see if there's any historical evidence matching the Book of Mormon's claims about America. According to the Book of Mormon, the descendants of these Jews who sailed to America became two civilizations, the Nephites and the Lamanites. Now, a lot of people might say, oh, the Lamanites are the bad guys and the Nephites are the good guys. The truth is, according to the Book of Mormon, it's more complicated than that. There were times when the Lamanites helped the Nephites, especially when the Nephites had fallen away from the ideal of worship described in the Book of Mormon. And there were also times when the Nephites helped the Lamanites and challenged them to return to godliness. These civilizations described in the Book of Mormon supposedly had roads, ironworking, even horses. But here is a problem. There were no horses in America before the arrival of the Spanish, at least not for thousands of years before their arrival. One argument I've heard is that maybe they encountered tapirs and mistook them for horses. To be honest, tapirs are sufficiently different from horses to not be confused with them, so I don't find that explanation convincing. Tapirs are also not easy to domesticate. They're unsuitable for riding and not herd animals. The Native American populations used dogs for pulling sleds, and in South America they had llamas for carrying loads. But as far as I know, no horses, roads, or ironworking, in contrast to the Book of Mormon's description. To find evidence of Book of Mormon peoples, some people have suggested connections between the Uto-Aztecan family of languages and Semitic languages, noting many similar sounding words, such as those for old, bee, black, and fruit, sounding very similar in both languages. However, in Indo-European languages, similar words for basic concepts like mother and father are common across related languages. Generally speaking, words which children would hear and learn first tend to be more similar across languages that are related to each other. But such linguistic similarities are not a pattern followed between Uto-Aztecan and Semitic languages, at least as far as I know. If I'm wrong, I'm happy to be corrected. Another thing to consider is genetics. If a large influx of Jewish people had arrived in the Americas about 600 BC, we might expect to see genetic evidence for this. And yet this is largely absent. There is one haplogroup, X2A, that appears in both Middle Eastern and North American populations. Its distribution is interesting because it's found around New England, which is where Joseph Smith claims to have discovered the golden plates. However, geneticists explain this genetic admixture as dating back thousands of years before Book of Mormon times, to when people crossed the ice bridge over the Bering Strait, migrating into North America, whereas according to the Book of Mormon, the Jews entered North America about 600 BC. Another curious point is that many locations mentioned in the Book of Mormon correspond to places where Native American populations built burial sites and mounds around ancient city complexes. One famous example is the Great Serpent Mound in southern Ohio, which is an ancient earthwork shaped like a snake. We know very little about the people who built these mounds, and excavation has been limited, largely because Native American communities understandably want to protect these sacred resting places. If future excavations were to uncover Jewish writings or artifacts, that would definitely change my mind about the historicity of the Book of Mormon. But as far as I'm aware, no such evidence has been found beyond what Joseph Smith claimed in the 19th century. So, in terms of truthfulness, some parts of the story of the Book of Mormon correspond quite well with reality, while other parts diverge from what current archaeological and historical records show. For me, that's not enough evidence to make the leap and join the faith, but I'm definitely glad to have done the research. This leads to another aspect of the reputation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Growing up, I noticed a general wariness or suspicion around the Mormon Church. There's quite a bit of negativity tied to it in public perception. One common criticism I've heard is about the practice of baptisms for the dead. Some people find this practice creepy. The idea that Mormons perform baptisms on behalf of their deceased relatives almost seems like they're claiming them for the church, even if those people had no connection to Mormonism or expressed any interest in it in life. And this can feel unsettling or invasive to outsiders. There are also many allegations about the church and money. The Latter-day Saint Church is often described as the wealthiest religious organisation in the world, reportedly holding more assets than even the Vatican. Tithing, the practice of members giving a portion of their income to the church, is strongly encouraged. This was one of the more surprising changes I saw in my friend when he became a member. He definitely used to think tithing was an exploitative demand, but he told me he now actually does it quite willingly. So, while it might surprise outsiders, it is genuinely a part of the church's teachings and culture. Another controversial part of Latter-day Saints history involves polygamy, the practice of having one husband and many wives. Joseph Smith, the church's founder, and Brigham Young, who led the church after Joseph's death, both practiced polygamy. This doctrine was openly taught and practiced until around the time Utah was seeking statehood within the United States. At that point, the church officially discontinued the practice, claiming it was a temporary measure necessary for population growth in the early days, but was no longer required or condoned. I can happily attest that my friend still only has one wife, as do all the other married Latter-day Saints who I met, so this practice is definitely not part of the modern mainstream LDS Church. The history of polygamy, however, continues to be a frequent point of criticism against the Church. There are also accusations of sexism. In the Latter-day Saint Church, only men can hold the priesthood, which is a significant religious authority. This policy is genuine and long-standing, and it is a frequent source of critique, especially from outside observers who see it as discrimination. Finally, allegations of racism have also been levied against the Latter-day Saint Church. There is a verse in the Book of Mormon that describes the Lamanites as being cursed with a skin of blackness. Because the Lamanites are often portrayed as antagonists, while the light-skinned Nephites are often portrayed as protagonists, many people view this as reinforcing negative racial stereotypes. This perception contributes to ongoing debate and concern about racial attitudes historically connected with the Church. So, how do my experiences tally with all of this? And is the Church of Latter-day Saints, are the Mormons, actually a cult? I can see why people might have found the early Mormons to be a cult. You have these people leaving mainstream life, gathering around a radical leader, giving up their possessions and trekking halfway across the continent to Utah. That's going to raise eyebrows. But it's easy to label unfamiliar beliefs as cultish. Once you've done that, you don't really have to engage with them. You can just write them off. And honestly, most of us don't interact much with the LDS Church. You might have a Mormon friend or colleague, but in my experience, they're not pushy. They're usually just happy to carry on with their lives, just like everyone else. So, is the LDS Church a cult? I think the truth's more complicated. And I've tried to be fair, because reality isn't black and white. Yes, Mormons tithe 10% of their income, but my friend can request a breakdown of how that money's used. And while the church leadership reportedly receives decent living allowances, up to $133,000 reportedly, the pay gap from the bottom to top is about a 1:6 ratio. That's not extreme by organisational standards. I once worked for a charity with a 1:22 ratio, and no one batted an eyelid. Latter-day Saint families also tend to be better off than average. They're more likely to be married, have children, raise teenagers who are statistically more pro-social than their peers. So, despite giving a lot to the church, they don't seem to be worse off for it. In fact, in many ways, they're thriving more than regular society. Latter-day Saint church life does follow traditional gender roles, with activities often split into men's and women's groups. Whether that feels sexist depends on your own outlook. I come from a traditional family setup, and aside from my wife earning more than me, our household still fits that mould. It works for us. If that model bothers you and you're not comfortable with it, Latter-day Saint culture might feel outdated. If that model doesn't bother you, it might feel entirely normal to you. As for polygamy, yes, early Mormon leaders like Joseph Smith and Brigham Young practiced it. But so did many Old Testament figures. And the mainstream church doesn't do it now. There is an offshoot group, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which does still practice it, but the main church distances itself from them as far as it possibly can. You'll be hard pushed to find a typical Latter-day Saint family today that doesn't follow the standard one man, one wife model. In fact, the nuclear family seems pretty baked in to Latter-day Saint culture today. Baptism for the dead might sound odd, but in cultures that honour ancestors, like Japan, Christianity's lack of focus on ancestry can often be seen as equally odd, and a drawback for people investigating the faith. Personally, I actually like the idea. If I died thinking there was no Book of Mormon, or that it wasn't true, and found out that I was wrong, and then my son joined the church later and baptised me by proxy, so I got a second chance to reach the celestial kingdom, I would be absolutely thrilled by that opportunity. I'd be over the moon, and to me that is not creepy, that is hopeful. As for the racism argument, a good counterpoint I've seen is the image portrayed in 3 Nephi, where the Book of Mormon asserts that Jesus visited the Americas. In the picture which you can see here, Native Americans are coming to him, and he has his arms open, welcoming them. He wants to receive them, teach them, love them, just as he did to people in the old world. So, when I hear people claim that the ethos of the Latter-day Saints Church is racist, it confuses me, because these are people who actively assert that God didn't just care for the old world, he cared about the whole world. Not just Israel, Egypt or Europe, but North America too. When I think of my own home, Glastonbury Tor, Maiden Castle, Cadbury Castle, I know that every culture sees its land as sacred. We give thanks to whatever deity our tradition acknowledges for putting it there. So when I see the Book of Mormon claims that sacred things happened in America, whether it's true or not, I see a clear assertion that the land is sacred, that the people who live there are sacred, that they are every bit as valued by God as anyone else anywhere else. In that sense, we are all Nephites. Am I wrong about that? Maybe. Am I right? Hopefully. Clearly, things have happened in the church's past that aren't good, but that's how I see it. One moment that did make me reflect about current discrimination in the Latter-day Saint Church, which I will share with you, is a tendency to shorten missionaries' surnames that are hard to pronounce, Sister P or Sister A, rather than longer names which are difficult to pronounce. One sister in particular, near the end of her mission, gently corrected me by using her full name when I referred to her as Sister P. She was too polite to make a fuss, but her using her full name in that sense did make me realise I'd actually been calling her by her wrong name the whole time. And when I realised that, I hoped that she knew I meant no offence. But it did make me think, was that a bit discriminatory of us all to do that? So, is the LDS Church a cult? In my view, maybe it looked that way once. But now, personally, I don't think so. Some beliefs are certainly unusual, definitely varying from standard Christian teaching substantially. But in its current form, I don't see the LDS Church as dangerous. So, how was it? Honestly, it's been a real privilege getting to know the people I've met through the Mormon Church. Some things have surprised me, some things have concerned me, and a few things have genuinely challenged me to grow. What surprised me? For starters, it surprised me that Joseph Smith got some things right. Other people saw the plates. The story is more complicated than I thought, which is great. I love a complex story, and it really made me think about the historical background to the events portrayed in the Book of Mormon. A more practical thing, but something very crucial that also surprised me in a good way, was the issues around child protection. I'd heard the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had a poor track record, even discouraging people from going to the police in cases of this kind of thing. But during one of my early visits, there was a sermon for the whole congregation around this very issue, and the bishop made it very clear to the whole congregation, if there is any kind of issue, go straight to the police. The church does have its own resources for dealing with these things, but don't mess about. If there's concerns, you can go straight to the police, he told the congregation, and that reassured me that they do take this issue seriously. I also found the Latter-day Saint culture in general to be far less dogmatic than I had expected. People celebrated Halloween. No one batted an eye when my friend's kids painted on a copy of the Book of Mormon. The pray and see attitude also challenged me. I'm someone who tends to intellectualize everything, as you can probably tell from this channel. But the openness of that approach I found refreshing, and it made me reflect. And honestly, everybody I met in the Latter-day Saint Church, elders, sisters, regular members, were all incredibly friendly, and I'm really grateful for that. What things concerned me? One thing that did concern me was how missionaries are cared for emotionally. One sister lost her grandmother while she was on her mission, and still came out to teach a lesson. Once I found out what had happened, I respected her choice, but I did worry she might be suppressing her grief. Some kind of bereavement leave to me seems essential, and the incident made me concerned for how much the church hierarchy cared for the missionaries' well-being. Tithing transparency also raised questions. The Latter-day Saints Church is reportedly the wealthiest religious organisation in the world. I don't think this is something individual members are overly concerned about, but I do wonder what happens with all that money. Some goes to temple construction, sure, but I'd love to know more. Another concern, and probably the main concern for me, was the lack of archaeological evidence. I like my faith to have some logical or historical support, and that makes the Book of Mormon difficult for me to accept at face value. though my LDS friends seem to draw great meaning from it regardless of the archaeology, which is fantastic. I also personally struggle with rigid hierarchy in religion. I prefer things less formal, but if the structure happens to be true, I would deal with it. What things challenged me? One moment that stuck with me ever since came from an encounter I had with a sister missionary. In conversation with her, I told her about some struggles with depression and anxiety, and my struggle to overcome these to be a good husband and father. And she simply said to me one thing that helped her was the phrase, "Don't let Satan steal your joy." And I don't know why, but that statement has really landed with me. I wrote it down, I still look at it sometimes, and it reminds me to live with gratitude and joy, even in tough times. Or when I feel that black dog of depression coming on me, I'll sometimes say that statement to myself to remind me. Another challenge was the call to seek God more directly through prayer. I don't do that enough, but seeing how central it is for many Mormons has pushed me to try. There have also been little serendipities. Once a missionary quoted one of my favourite Bible verses, something from Amos, completely out of the blue. It's not a very commonly read book or a commonly cited verse even within that book. But whether that's divine communication or some kind of Jungian collective unconsciousness, I don't know. Perhaps I'm overthinking it, but it did make me think. And the biggest challenge, seeing people build such sincere, vibrant faith on a historical foundation that lacks archaeological evidence. That's hard for me to reconcile. And yet, from what I've observed, it does seem to work for them. They seem to live well, be happy. And maybe that's something worth paying attention to. So, what do you think? If you're interested and want to find out more and dive into this a bit, my advice would be, don't just take one side's word for things. There's a whole load of arguments out there. Alessa Grenville is a good person to watch. She's quite critical of the Latter-day Saints, but she does have a big trove of experience and videos out there. I even left a comment on one of her videos, something I don't usually do. She did a video called "My Mormon Mission Was a Waste," which made me feel really sad for her. It can't be nice to put so much effort into something only to look back on it with the feeling that you had promoted a lie for 2 years. I commented that I had had positive times with the missionaries I had met, and that even if she no longer believes this stuff, her mission was not a waste. Any young person going out into the world with a desire to do good is something to be celebrated. It's a wonderful thing. Whether you're correct or not, that desire to help others is a brilliant, brilliant thing. A pro Latter-day Saint commentator I really like is Jacob Hansen of Thoughtful Faith. I was really impressed by his debate with atheist Alex O'Connor. He did an amazing job of arguing the Latter-day Saint position, which isn't always the easiest to defend. It's a bit like the theology equivalent of watching Luxembourg beat Germany at football. One thing to bear in mind with the internet though, both sides can be quite catty about each other, and sometimes they'll even know each other and call each other out a little, so do bear that in mind. People can also have a bad experience that they have had and feel like it applies to all Mormons or all ex-Mormons, and that can affect their perspective a bit. But if you like a bit of drama like that, maybe that might be something you'll quite enjoy. People say that truth is often stranger than fiction, and I think the LDS Church is no exception to this. So please do check out both sides if you want to know more, and go beyond the things you see on TV shows. It's really interesting. It's also worth pointing out that any item of controversy around the church will have a statement about it on its own website. So weigh both of these sources up and see what you think. Ultimately, however, I found that I couldn't believe in this without any evidence of the North American side of things, from the history, the archaeology. It's a bridge too far for me. But that doesn't mean that the Mormon Church has no value to me. I think it's clear that it has lots of amazing and valuable teaching, and that it makes a real contribution to the happiness of its members. I have absolute admiration for anyone trying to tread that straight and narrow way to the celestial kingdom, and a special admiration for any young people willing to sacrifice a big slice of their lives for the sake of trying to serve others. Whether someone is theologically right or wrong, that desire and the compunction to carry it out is worthy of respect. I'll leave this video with a little anecdote from the Preston Temple and my friend's sealing. I wasn't allowed into the temple when my friend was being sealed. I wasn't expecting to be allowed in, and I'm quite happy with boundaries. I accept that there are situations in life where you want the people around you to fully believe with you, and I was really pleased just to be able to be there on that day. It was lovely to be able to walk the grounds. They were really beautiful, and it was great to see the missionary training centre. At one point, one of the missionaries from Brazil came up and had some pictures taken with her Brazilian flag in front of the temple. There was another group of missionary trainees heading off to play a game of basketball. They were all happy, all enthusiastic. And the two missionaries from that time when we first visited the church, who gave us such a great welcome, were there. One had now finished her mission, was back in Utah, married, and working in a temple herself, which was great to see. She had come back especially for this day. The other was finishing her mission very soon. Afterwards, we hung out at the reception at one of the members' houses, and everyone was very nice, chilled out, and happy. I was just thinking to myself, it was really great to have had a window into this world. And as I was reflecting on the day, there was one conversation which really struck me. A conversation with one of the members outside. He had stayed out to take care of the kids while the rest of the grown-ups went in. I was saying a little bit about where I was and why, in terms of what I believed about the Mormon faith. And he shared with me that he feels like that's where faith comes in. God will not always tell us everything, but show us the door, and then we have to rely on our faith for the rest. And it reminded me of a song from a certain play that I saw once, which I'm going to sign off with.
Oh God, why are you letting me die without having me show people the plates? They'll have no proof I was telling the truth or not. They'll have to believe it just 'cause, oh, I guess that's kinda what you were going for.
Thank you very much for listening to this video till the end. Please feel free to like, comment and subscribe. There's more things coming up, but thank you very much for your time and your attention. I hope you found this as interesting as I found it, having all of these wonderful and fascinating experiences. Till next time, goodbye.